If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit thedihedral.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll!
So welcome to another episode of the Dihedral podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Gaia along with Kara. And today we have the privilege and the opportunity to be speaking to a climate scientist, very prominent and knowledgeable, Dr. Andrew Dessler.
Yeah, before we get started, I just want to give a little background on Dr. Dessler. He's a climate scientist and professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University. His research subject areas are atmospheric chemistry, climate change, and climate change policy, with a BA in physics from Rice, a master's and PhD from Harvard in chemistry, and 2 years of postdoc research at NASA. He's a former senior policy analyst for the White House Office of Science and Technology. He has over 100 publications credited to his name and is the author of several books, including the recently updated third edition of The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change. Today, Dr. Dessler adds to his towering resume that he was a guest on the Dihedral podcast. Dr. Dessler, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, let me open my CV and add this really quickly.
Please do. It'll carry a long way. I was just going to jump right in and ask, how screwed are we? But I was advised that might not reach the level of professionalism that we're aiming for. So let me rephrase and add some context to that question. I'm a philosophy professor with a primary focus in the philosophy of love. And within discussions about love, one of the most common settings referenced as ideally romantic is walking along a beach, holding hands, and sipping a glass of wine. At our current rate of climate change, how much longer will this image be possible? In other words, what will happen when there are no beaches and no grapes to make wine?
Will always be beaches. I mean, there'll always be the land-ocean interface. It'll just be, instead of being in Houston or in Galveston, it'll be in Navasota. So getting back to your question about sort of how bad is it? The analogy I like to use is that you're on the highway and you're driving along at 65 miles an hour, and the car ahead of you slams on its brakes, and you know immediately you're going to hit it. Yeah, you're not going to be able to stop. So then the question becomes, how fast you want to hit it. If we had slammed on the brakes 15 or 20 years ago, we could have avoided hitting it at all, or at least we could have had just a very minor fender bender. Now we're at the stage where we're going to hit it at 15 miles an hour if we really take action, or if we don't hit the brakes at all, we'll hit it at 50 miles an hour. So I don't like to think about it in terms of how bad it's going to be. I like to think about the fact that we still control to some extent how bad it's going to be. I mean, we've already had a degree of warming since pre-industrial, 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And so so we've already experienced climate change, and regardless of what we do, we will continue to experience climate change, some amount of climate change. But the question is, are we going to hit the car ahead of us at 50 miles an hour, or are we going to hit it at 60 miles an hour? We still control that. And so I think that's a decision for society to make. And the worst part about it is, at least for me, is it's not us in the car, it's our kids. I don't plan on being alive in 2100, but my kids could be. I mean, they're 14, about to turn 15. Their generation easily could be alive in 2100. And so they're the ones who, so it's really, we're driving a car, we're deciding how hard our kids are going to hit the car ahead of us. As a philosopher, I'm sure you recognize that there are a lot of philosophical issues involved in this. Climate change is the granddaddy of moral problems, I think.
Yeah, and well, now that we're going deeper into climate change, and as you have mentioned, we need to give some context to it, because not all of us are experts. I think I talk on behalf of my fellow non-scientists. We might know a little bit of it because we've heard it. Now it's being widely covered by the mainstream media, etc., because of the current events that are going on, not only in the U.S., but worldwide, and we're get into that later. But you're a professor at Texas A&M of atmospheric sciences, and I'm sure that at a certain point in the semester you have to go over climate change or mention it. and you have a wide range of students that go from ones that have previous knowledge on the topic all the way to skeptics. So let's say that we are in that exact same scenario, and you have to cover the topic. So we're in the classroom, and I raise my hand, and I ask you, Dr. Dessler, what exactly is climate change?
Right. Well, I mean, I'll correct you in one regard. I don't mention climate change. I mean, the classes I teach are climate change. So it's
Even
14
more so.
weeks. It's 14 weeks of climate change, 3 hours a week. So, we start at the beginning, and, what is climate change? It is the fact that, as commonly used, the fact that humans are emitting a lot of gases into the atmosphere that trap heat. Mainly that comes from burning of fossil fuels. We talk in the class about how what we really mean are gases that absorb infrared radiation, but we go over the science of it. And the science is not that complicated. These are students that have never had a climate course. They've never had calculus. It's just algebra and some basic physical principles that will lead you to the conclusion that if you add a gas that absorbs infrared radiation heat to the atmosphere, you'll warm the surface. This is something that is nearly 200 years old. I mean, this is Fourier, Tyndall, Arrhenius, some of the giants of science worked this out in the 19th century. And, we know we're adding greenhouse gases, these heat trapping gases, the atmosphere. We would predict the climate was warming. In fact, it was predicted in the 19th century that we would warm the climate. And indeed, the climate is warming. It's warming exactly as much as we expect it to. So that's climate change. The effluence of our economic activity is warming the climate.
And I remember that. So when you mention greenhouse gas emissions, because sometimes the coverage focuses on carbon dioxide, and we need to be net zero with carbon dioxide by 2050, et cetera. And there's some numbers, but I had to do some research, mainly on the agriculture sector. But I discovered that greenhouse gases, it's composed by beyond carbon dioxide. You have nitrous oxide, you have methane, and then two others. The name was too complex, and you can tell that I'm not a science major. But then I discovered that it's a very complex topic because you have different sectors that release different gases by different practices. So you need to address different topics, and then you have big corporations that make that process challenging. In agriculture, it would be the big ags, for example.
Right, that's right. So carbon dioxide is the single most important gas in climate change. And the reason for that is that the lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very long. On human timescales that we care about, the lifetime of CO2 is essentially infinite. Once you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it just stays there. It eventually does come out, but on very much longer than a human lifetime timescale. Other gases, methane, for example, has a 10-year lifetime in the atmosphere. And so in theory, if we cut methane emissions down, it would exit the atmosphere pretty quickly. And so carbon dioxide is really the focus. Now, you're absolutely right, which is that other gases are important. And if you look at how much heat is being trapped right now, carbon dioxide is about 50%, and all of the other greenhouse gases, if you add them together, is also about 50%. Now, as time goes on, carbon dioxide is going to keep growing because we're continuing to add carbon dioxide. None of it's leaving the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide is just building up. It's like you're dumping water into your bathtub after you stop the drain up. The water level just keeps going up. So CO2 just keeps building up in the atmosphere. And so in 100 years, it will be 90% CO2. And that's why we have to get CO2 emissions to zero. Now, along the way, we do need to attack these other greenhouse gases. But carbon dioxide is number one. And if you don't attack carbon dioxide, you will not solve the problem. So it is necessary and really sufficient to head off the really large warming that we want to avoid over this century.
There's a lot of science behind it, and you're mentioning what happens with carbon dioxide and how it's accumulating, etc. But we still have people that deny it and say, no, look, this is not happening, or at least
I'm aware of that.
they cover your eyes. And yes, exactly.
I have run into them.
Well, and I wanted to ask you that, how do you address people like that, especially with the level of knowledge that you have and your expertise. That's what you do for a living. You study it, you do research about it. So it's like they are delegitimizing, is that a word? I'm from Venezuela.
Yeah.
I do my best with my English. Your work.
Yeah. So what you find when you talk to, if you talk to your congressional representative or somebody for whom credibility is important, very few of them really outright deny climate change or humans' influence. They might try to soft pedal it and say, well, we're not really sure. I agree humans are changing the climate, but there's a lot of stuff we don't know. And then they switch over their economic arguments about how we don't want to bankrupt our economy trying to solve this problem. I think we can just adapt to warmer temperatures. Very few people, again, you've talked to people, CEOs, most of them don't really anymore deny the science of climate. The people who do that are people like on Twitter, and you just don't engage them. I tell my students, if you run into somebody who really will tell you, like, I don't think the Earth's warming and NASA's fudging the numbers, it's not worth arguing with them, because you will not convince them. All you will do is make them mad, because it's not. None of these people have actually looked at the science, understood it, and made a reasoned scientific judgment about the quality of the science. What they've done is they start with a philosophical view about the role of government, or about their tribe, who they belong to, and they adopt positions that are consistent with that. And if you argue with them, you're really undercutting their identity. And so those arguments don't go well. And so I just don't engage them. I have a brother-in-law who doesn't believe in climate change. And, for the good of the family, I just don't argue with them. And I think he would like to argue about it, but I know I'm a lot happier just changing the subject when he brings it up, and because he's not convincible, and so the debate has really changed. I think most people, if you talk to my representative Bill Flores in the Texas 17th district, he goes on about, I believe in climate change and humans are doing it, but then he spins around. He goes, we don't need a government we don't need a price on carbon. We don't need taxes. We don't need. So it's really, in some sense, I don't have a problem with that. He acknowledges science, and it becomes a policy argument.
Now that you mentioned the policy argument, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Karen, I'm just taking over. But I had the opportunity to read one of your opinion pieces, your op-eds, and I believe it was the one in 2013 that you emphasize a lot on it, in the fact that the debate on climate change is no longer about science, but it's about policy. So I wanted to understand, and I think it's important for all of us to understand as citizens and members of just the global community, how do scientific and policy debates work? Does it influence in any way the decisions that our leaders make, as in like creating regulations or rolling them back or eliminating them?
Well, science certainly should. I think you could make the argument that our present administration is trying as hard as possible to get science out of the regulatory process. But just common sense should tell you, if you're deciding whether to regulate an effluent from a smokestack, you have to know what the impacts are. If something's completely harmless, like water vapor, you don't regulate it. You should never regulate water vapor coming out of the stack, because it doesn't do anything. But if something is really bad, particulate matter or oxides of nitrogen, then you should regulate that. And science is what tells you what to do. And so science certainly should inform regulations. I think over the last 50 years, when you look at the various environmental problems, science has informed them. But here's the thing: if you don't want to do regulations, if you're philosophically opposed to regulations, then what you want to do is you want to kill science. Because once you get rid of science, then you get rid of the foundation for regulating. And the current administration no longer views regulation as a valid tool to protect the general population. It's just something that's getting in the way of companies making profits, even if it's harming the economy. If it's generating more profits, then they want to get rid of the regulations, and so they view science as an enemy. At least that's my interpretation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with some of these deniers or skeptics, I mean, these people vote. And that's one of those things where I'd like to at least have some tools to sort of counter their ideas. I was listening to a talk you gave a while back with regard to voting and convincing people and things like that. But I think there has to be something that we can do to sort of turn their point of view. One of the things you mentioned is that it's not something we have to wait to see the effects of. I mean, of course, we see it all over the world, but something especially in a place like Texas, the air conditioning bills are going up, or the gas prices potentially are going up. These are effects that we can point to, that even if people aren't convinced by the science, there's perhaps other ways to convince them, that is maybe based on capital.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the polling data, so people have done a lot of polling data on this, and the people who are really deeply dismissive about climate think it's a hoax, think scientists are in it, to pad their pockets. Um, those actually, there aren't that many of them, maybe 10% of the population. So as far as, convincing them, I don't know that you really need to convince them. They're really following the lead. I think they are largely following the lead of their opinion leaders. The people in the White House, the people in Congress, who are effectively doing the bidding of corporations. Corporations don't like regulations. They would much rather not get rid of any pollution and then just emit it to the atmosphere, and it can sicken and kill people downwind, but they don't pay those costs. So but they get all the profit from emitting, and so they would much rather do that. And then they find people in Congress who are ideologically who've convinced themselves somehow that that's good for society. That's really, I think, the great lie of the last 40 years, starting with Reagan, is this idea that getting rid of regulations is good for the economy and good for society. In fact, that maybe there certainly are some regulations that you can always find a regulation that's maybe doesn't act correctly, but regulations by and large are the way governments control corporations from taking advantage of people that don't have any power, which is essentially most of us. If you don't like what Facebook is doing with your private data, you're screwed. You have zero capability to talk to Facebook and convince them to do something different. I mean, only the government can do that. And if you don't like what there are all these refineries in Houston that after these big storms are dumping a lot of crap in the atmosphere. If you don't like that, they're not going to listen to you. You have no power over them. It's only the government can do that. And so, I think that the fight we need to have now is one over what's we spent the last 40 years delegitimizing government regulation of companies, and that needs to stop if we want to solve climate change. If we don't solve that, we will never solve the problem of climate. We'll never solve healthcare. I mean, there are all these big problems that can't be solved without government regulation.
When you mentioned, the government regulation, it reminds me of, right now, the Green New Deal, that when it came out, it was, oh my God, this is insane. So much intervention, etc. But one of the goals it's to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and then half of that by 2030 by addressing different sectors. But and this is me, my ignorant self, because I don't know much more than whatever is posted in the media. And sometimes I'm a mass communication major, and I understand that media it's there to manipulate the masses. So you have the agenda theory, whatever you want the people to believe, you put out there, and some things you leave behind. But every time I read a headline that says this current administration is looking to roll back certain measure, or they got rid of this measure, I get anxious because I say, how is this going to affect that ultimate 2050 goal or 2030 goal? Is it actually going to affect it significantly, or what's going to happen with all of these plans that started in 2015 or so? It started a long time ago for them to be able to reach that certain goal, but 10 years from now, because 2030 is tomorrow. I'm exaggerating, but it's
Right.
near.
Yeah, I think this certainly the Obama administration put in their clean power plan, which was a policy to try to reduce emissions. It was relatively modest, but I think it would have had some impact on reducing emissions. And the Trump administration is trying to roll that back. I guess they have rolled it back. And so, yeah, I mean, we're not on any kind of glide slope to get to our emissions down very fast. And so, if you remember my analogy from the beginning, we're sort of committing ourselves to run into the car ahead of us at really high speed. And the longer you wait, the faster, even if you apply the brakes, there's a limit to how fast you can stop a car with the brakes, and there's a limit to how fast we can reduce emissions. And if we don't start now, um, it's going to commit ourselves to more warming. I mean, we should have started in the 80s or the latest in the 90s. I mean, we really understood the problem then, but it was just, it was not politically palatable to do that then. But if we had, we could be at, much lower emissions now and cleaner air. I mean, fossil fuels exert enormous cost on our society. Everything from air pollution, which kills tens of thousands of Americans every year, millions of people worldwide, in addition to the fact that we spend a lot of money on defense to be able to defend oil assets spread around the world, especially in the Middle East. And, we end up having to deal with really odious regimes that don't reflect American values at all because of our reliance on oil. I'm referring here, of course, to Canada. Um, um, and so, there's an enormous cost to fossil fuels. And if we just started 15 years ago or 20 years ago, we could be much further down the line than we are now. And so, the fact that we're not doing anything now just is going to make it that much worse. And again, it's going to be worse for young people, for people who are kids today. They're the ones who are going to be in the wreck, not us, or not me.
So when we talk about things getting that much worse, I feel like sometimes there's this wide-eyed optimism that science will figure it out, right? There's certain examples of this. The ozone layer kind of comes to mind, where there was a problem and we fixed it, so we'll solve the problem when we need to fix that problem. And sometimes, even with people who understand that there is a problem, I'm not sure they understand just how horrendous it could be. That is, if we're slamming to somebody at 50 miles per hour, what that actually looks like for our kids or our kids' kids, or what this planet could look like in 50 to 100 years. I mean, it's already having effects now that are damaging worldwide. But I'm wondering if you could give a little insight onto what a 50 mile per hour accident would look like in terms of, I don't know, a person listening to this in Nebraska, or a person listening to this in Oregon, or something like that.
Sure. So the way I like to explain this is, if you go back to the last ice age, so last glacial maximum was about 20,000 years ago. And, the world looked completely different then. There was ice covering much of North America, and ice thousands of feet thick. I mean, there's 3,000 feet of ice over Boston. Sea level was 300 feet lower. Ecosystems look completely different. I mean, it was really a different world. And if you ask yourself, what was the temperature difference? How much you have to cool the planet to get an ice age? It's about 5 degrees Celsius, which is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look at the temperature change that we're predicting for this century, the upper limit is about 5 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So the upper limit, sort of the worst case scenario of warming this century, is equal to the warming since the last ice age. And think about how much that changed the world. Now think about doing that more, 5 more degrees Celsius of warming, 10 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. And it's actually worse than that. Coming out of the last ice age took 10,000 years. So it was about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in 10,000 years. So a degree Fahrenheit per millennium. We're going to do 10 degrees in 100 years. So it's going to be a bad ride. And as I always tell my students, I'm sorry, this is your problem, and we're not doing anything to head it off. And another thing to do is think about it this way. So look around the world right now. So you have Hurricane Harvey in Houston. So 40, 50 inches of rain. You've got Australia is literally on fire. California is on fire. Look at the impacts we have right now, and then tell yourself, this is 1 degree Celsius of warming, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now let's multiply that by 5, and it's not linear. It's not going to be 5 times worse. It's going to be 25 times worse. It's going to be some non-linear phenomenon. It'll be exponential or a lot worse than 5 times as bad as what we have. Now that's the worst case. It could be maybe half that bad, and this is warming by 2100. So maybe in 2100 we'll only have 3 degrees Celsius, 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. But in that case, we'll get 10 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in 2150 or 2200. Maybe instead of your kids, it'll be your grandkids. This is going to be a very bad ride if we don't do something about it.
I'm sorry. Okay, it took it's hard to take in. I'm gonna need a drink after this podcast because it is heartbreaking. I have a little one, and I do think about that, and I know youth. And okay, I'm generalizing, which is a fallacy. I shouldn't be generalizing, but the people that I talk to around my age and everything, sometimes they question, do I really want to have kids or not? Because I wouldn't want to put them through this. And this reminds me of this movement that started with Greta Thunberg and Molly Steer, etc. Everyone's relying on youth now. Oh, I'm so glad that our youth, they know what to do, they have the right mind, they're understanding the situation. But I'm afraid that by the time that they become experts, there will no longer be a cause to fight for. How will the world will look like whenever they have the chance to actually do something about it? So it is, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if they need to be experts. I mean, at this point, the science is sufficiently well established that you can simply say, I'm going to do what it's more than 97%, 99.9% of the scientists tell me. They agree the earth is warming and humans are responsible, and future warming, at the worst case scenario is really bad. And the other thing I've noticed is, in all of these events, somebody rises up and becomes a leader, and you don't really know who it's going to be in advance. I think a lot of it's timing as well as everything else. Greta Thunberg, it looks like she's the person who's really catalyzing this, and it's young people, as it should be. I mean, they've got skin in the game. They have more skin in the game than I do, and they're the ones who are really going to get crunched by this. So I'm really amazed to see the impact that they've had, and it's maybe this is what it will take to get people to move. It'll take a lot of kids talking to their parents. I mean, I certainly hope that's happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, two things I kind of want to talk about. I'll try to figure out a good way to frame the question, but one of them is accountability. There's people who are kind of maneuvering politicians to make choices that are definitely not healthy for the environment. But in the end, those people perhaps are thinking, I will never be held accountable to this. I'll be long gone by the time any of these changes occur. Is there anything that you see or that you've experienced that would allow us to hold some of these people who are just flat out ignoring the problem to be held accountable?
So there are really two questions there. One is sort of the question of, should we do that? And then the other question is, do I think it'll happen? I think in the U.S., nobody's going to ever be held accountable. Those, people like that, the people who are responsible, the people who are in Washington, lobbyists who are running the tobacco denial playbook, will never be held accountable. I mean, look at the tobacco case. Nobody personally was ever held accountable. Look at the subprime mortgage bailout. Nobody was ever held accountable. I mean, in our society, we just don't. We'd much rather send someone who's caught with an ounce of marijuana to prison for 10 years than, hold a white collar person who might be responsible for a coal mine collapse or, a pension fund getting drained. Those people just are not held accountable. So I think it's very unlikely they will. And ultimately, I would be more than happy to let them go if we started taking action. I mean, I think this is not about who's responsible for why the car ahead of us stopped. I think it's a lot more about we need to get our act together and start hitting the brakes. At this point, I would be willing to accept a lot of things I think are kind of suboptimal to see action. So I'm not a big fan of nuclear. I think nuclear's got some real problems. But if there was a policy that said we're going to build a lot of nuclear plants, we're going to shut down all the coal plants, I'd say, right on, let's do it. I don't think that's a very good policy. I don't think that's good for the economy. But I would be happy to do it to get rid of fossil fuels.
I mean, we hear certain ideas about solutions, and I think part of that is voting, not only at the voting booth, but also voting with our credit cards. I mean, don't buy things that continue to affect the economy. I kind of have in mind things like Tesla versus Toyota or something like that. Not that Toyota's the worst. I'm not really sure who is, but I want to talk about maybe some other solutions that somebody just sitting in their living room or driving around right now might be able to do that can affect at least some change, and not just something that allows them to feel good, right? I didn't use a straw today versus I didn't vote for a person, just something that might actually instill help moving forward.
Yeah, so I get that question a lot. What can I do? And the short answer is that there are a lot of virtuous activities that individual people can do. You can change your light bulbs to LEDs. You can walk instead of drive somewhere. You can eat less meat. There are lots of things you can do. None of those are going to actually solve the problem, though. You should do them though, because you will be better off for them. Walking is good for you. Eating less meat is good for you. Changing your light bulbs will reduce your electricity bill. You should do all of them, but none of those are going to solve the problem. We need to solve the problem a global, coordinated solution, and the only way to do that is to elect people that agree with you on that. And so, that's what makes, I think, Greta Thunberg so powerful, is that she is changing the political landscape. I mean, that's what in the Extinction Rebellion, these are the things that you need to do to solve the problem. You need to change the politics of the problem. You need to elect people. You need to make sure that people who are in office realize that if I don't support renewable energy, there's going to be a cost to that. Right now, not only is there no cost, but there's a cost to supporting renewable energy if you're someone who gets a lot of money from fossil fuel interests, which a lot of politicians do. So, that's the number one thing to do if you care about this. However you can affect change, call your congressman, write op-eds, volunteer for a candidate who supports your views on any subject. This is not just climate, but on almost any subject. I mean, this is the way you start change. So I think people need to do that. Go to the climate marches if there is one near you, and make your voice heard in the political system. Now, I will say at the same time, people in power, at least in the U.S., are doing everything they can to stop to take away the political power from people that they know are going to disagree with them. Things like gerrymandering of districts, campaign finance regulations, things like that. So it's a battle. It's a race to see whether people who care about climate can make changes faster than the people who don't can take away their voting rights.
Yeah, the other day I had an argument with one of my good friends, and it was basically on the fact that he was saying, and if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, but he was saying something along the lines of, I believe in climate change, but I'm just so upset that they politicized it a lot. There's a way to manipulate the masses. But based on everything that you're saying, it's not that people politicized it, it's that there's a strong relationship between climate change and politics. Because at the end of the day, you're saying it needs to be a global coordination between world leaders to be able to come up with regulations and ways to change it. Because as individuals, we can do little things, but it won't solve the problem.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. The problem has been politicized. I mean, I have no idea what that actually means. I mean, it's a political question. So of course it's been politicized. It's the way you solve policy questions is you have public debates about them, and people make arguments, and they use all the techniques that people make when they're arguing. They try to appeal to reason if they can. If not, then they appeal. Then they if they don't have facts on their side, then they lie or they appeal to other things. And that's what happens. I think the subtext of the argument is somehow that the science has been tainted by politics, and that's just a weird conspiracy theory. I mean, there's no evidence that scientists have somehow adopted a political viewpoint that drives the science, and in fact, that's never happened. So, in the history of science, has never been a case of an entire field of science essentially committing fraud to push a policy standpoint. Now, the flip side, which is politicians lying about science, that happens all the time. That's not surprising. That's Tuesday. So I mean, it's. Are you going to believe that scientists are lying or politicians and lobbyists are lying? I mean, seriously. It's this so the idea of politicization, just it's an argument that doesn't make any sense to me.
I find it interesting. I guess it's more of a personal question where there's horrific consequences coming. Like that's just going to happen. But talking to you, you still kind of exhibit this level of optimism that we might be closer to the 15 mile per hour accident than the 50 mile per hour accident. I'm wondering where that optimism comes from.
Oh, I'm sorry if I sounded optimistic. No, I mean, I don't. I'm not saying we're closer to the 15 than the 50. I'm saying we still can achieve a 15 mile an hour collision. We can still achieve a century without a lot of warming, or we can have a century with a lot of warming. I mean, we can't have a century with no warming. And we're still going to, even the best case will have consequential warming. I mean, look at us, as I said, Australia's on fire. This is 1 degree. Even the best case, we're going to have maybe another degree of warming. So climate change, as I said, it's going to be a car wreck. We're going to hit the car ahead of us, but we control how fast it is. But I'm not optimistic. I would not say I'm optimistic that we've got things under control and we're doing the right things to have a slow collision. I don't think that at all. I think it's up in the air. We're at a moment of real. This is it. This is crunch time. And if in 10 or 15 years we haven't done anything, it's going to be very bad for our kids.
We can't have this discussion without mentioning Australia. And actually, we've mentioned it a lot of time, but without going deep into it. Well, we were talking about conspiracy theories and everything. There was, and still is ongoing, a big misinformation campaign saying that the fires were initiated by arson instead of climate change. And so many things that are going around it because people are still kind of closing their eyes to the issue. But I had a question, and this is more scientific-wise, so I would need your input, is what are currently the impacts of the Australian wildfires in relation to climate change and the emissions of CO2?
So let me just preface this by saying every time something happens, the people who want to cast doubt, people who want to oppose action on climate change will come up with the most ridiculous excuses to try to acquit carbon dioxide. So after Hurricane Harvey, it wasn't that we got 5 feet of rain and that was, a historical amount of rain. It was that, we paved over Katy, west of Houston. It's development. That's what it is. And so there's always something that they can blame. It's anything but carbon. It's always something else. I realize that, the defendant was found with a gun, smoking gun over the dead body, but he didn't do it. Come on. It was the person lived a very unhealthy lifestyle and ate eggs for breakfast every day. I mean, it would be comical if it didn't have such consequences. All right, so getting back to Australia, how is climate change affecting that? So climate change, I like to think of as like the effect of climate change on these extreme events is like the effect of steroids on a baseball player. So steroids don't hit home runs. They don't ever go to the plate. But what they can do is they can take someone who has warning track power and they can give them the ability to hit it out. And so climate change is making what would have been probably a pretty severe event but makes it worse. It elevates it to the next level. That's what it did with Hurricane Harvey. It took a storm that dumped 40 inches, or it takes a storm that would have dumped, say, 30 inches and made it dump 40 inches. And that's a big difference. And with the Australian wildfires, temperatures are going up. And as temperatures go up, things dry out faster. So you have a lot of vegetation. It's drier than it would have been. And that makes the wildfires worse. So there probably still would have been wildfires. They may still have been bad, but they've been worse because of climate change. And scientists haven't looked at the problem yet. Probably in the next year or two, there'll be scientific analyses about exactly how much worse it was. But we can say just common sense and physical intuition tells us that climate change is making that fire worse than it would have been otherwise.
And I think that speaks, if I'm right, to the nonlinear effects that you were talking about earlier with Australia burning, trees, I guess, releasing more CO2, or what it costs to replace the infrastructure that was already there. We input more CO2, and then which just sort of compounds building on that. And so right now it's Australia burning. With Australia burnt, that has the potential to lead to further places burning more rapidly and I guess more exhaustively than they are today, if I understand right.
Yeah, so you are getting some effluents from the fire, some carbon dioxide. I don't know how important that's going to be in the long run. So I don't think that this is some kind of feedback loop where the fires in Australia will make climate change worse. They'll make other places burn. I don't think you need that for it to be really scary. Even without that, we're seeing this. We're seeing this in multiple places: California, now Australia. I mean, so this is not a one-off, and this is the future. I mean, get used to it.
Wow.
Well, I will say that before you get too sad and go drink a whole bottle of wine. I mean, the thing that I always do think is I do think that we still have the capability. You all mentioned the idea of technology fixing us, and you look at the ozone hole, and technology did save us. But the key thing there is we have the technology. I mean, we know how to generate energy without emitting carbon dioxide. We know how to generate energy from wind. We know how to generate energy from solar. We know how to build nuclear power plants. I mean, again, I'm not a huge fan of nuclear, but I would take that over fossil fuels any day of the week. So we know how to do it. Now, it doesn't mean we have 100% of the technology right now, but people are incredibly clever. That's one thing that is true. People are smart, and once they know we're phasing out fossil fuels, technology innovation will occur. And so I do think that we can't, again, if all the leaders of the world got together, in fact, really, it's the U.S. If the U.S. really came and said, we're doing this, and we expect everyone else to do it, I think other countries would fall in line. I mean, Europe is already on board. China has a huge air pollution problem. Plus, they've developed a lot of technology. We're going to be buying technology from them, so they're going to love it. So, I mean, we can solve the problem, and it really doesn't. It's not going to take technological revolutions. I do think innovation's required on battery technology and things like that, but that's going to happen once people realize that there's an incentive to do that. So don't be too sad. Just channel your sadness into political action.
Well, in that advice that you just gave me, I think it's very important because people need to hear that and know that don't be lamenting about what's going on, but take action. And that's the form of taking action to address it.
Sure. Call your congressman, go volunteer, go call, figure out who's running for Congress in your district, find out what their climate plans are. And, if you like them, vote for them. If you don't, call them up and tell them you don't like them. And, you want them to be forward thinking and organize your friends. I mean, this is what it's going to take. And at some point in the future, you'll look back on this, you'll say, what did I do to try to take action? I don't think it takes, it doesn't require you to give up electricity. I mean, I still use electricity and I still drive a car, because in the world we live in, you really can't avoid doing that. But I do think that working together, we can change the world. So you don't need to do that. And, that's really, I mean, obviously you always need electricity, but, you won't have to use fossil fuels to generate that.
I have a quick question, and this is going a little bit back at what you're saying about technology. The other day I read an article and it was saying that I think for the budget, this year's budget, the current administration had allocated some money to do studies on climate geoengineering. And it's something along the lines of injecting something in the stratosphere. And what exactly is that?
So we know that volcanoes inject a lot of crap into the atmosphere. And we also know that the climate cools off after volcanoes go off. And it's because all the stuff they inject reflects sunlight back to space. So essentially, it's like putting a sunshade over the Earth. And so we could do that. Humans, we have the technological and industrial capability to start injecting sulfur into the atmosphere, and it would form these little droplets that reflect sunlight, essentially an artificial volcano. So we could do that. And, I analogize that to, it's like the airbags in your car. If I see there are sort of two different worlds we could go in. So one world, we handle climate change rationally. We start cutting emissions, and we level off, and then temperature kind of levels off, and then maybe starts to go down a little bit. And in that world, you don't need to do geoengineering. Kind of like, normally you don't need the airbags in your car. Okay, so normally if you drive rationally, you never use the airbags in your car. But the second world is a world where, say, it's 2040. We haven't done anything to address climate change. Climate change is out of control. We realize, this is really bad. I mean, this is, once the rich people realize that it's bad, things are going to happen. Even though they're making money hand over fist, they realize that if everybody else is getting hammered, it's going to hurt their bottom line. And so if you get to that world, then geoengineering may be the last page of the playbook, because you can't cut emissions. If you cut emissions, all you do is kind of stabilize the temperature. If you need to actually reduce the temperature of the planet, geoengineer and reduce it quickly, geoengineering is really your only option. So that's the last page of the playbook. So again, it's like the airbags in your car. If you have to stop really, really fast, you're glad you have them. It's the last line of defense.
I was reading in the article that there were, of course, opposing sides, because there's always going to be one, and they were saying, yes, you can do it, but I fear that people are doing it to just neglect doing the other things, like cutting emissions, etc. So they were saying the best case scenario would be doing both things at the same time.
Yeah, so for years, people have talked about this idea that, well, if you give people the option of geoengineering, then they won't want to cut emissions. It's the all chocolate dessert, or the all chocolate meal. Now, I've actually never heard anybody say that. I think that may have been true 30 or 40 years ago. But to be honest, nobody says, let's address climate change by geoengineering only. It's just not done. So I'm not sure that that's really the trade-off. But you are right. So because of that, I think everybody agrees that if you geoengineer, you still have to reduce emissions. And what geoengineering is doing is it's just buying you time to not, if you start trying to reduce emissions too late to avoid the really huge amounts of warming, it buys you time. It gives you a bit of a cushion. It really is like the airbags in your car. I mean, if you hit the brakes too late, it gives you it gives you the ability to hit something going a little faster and not be injured quite as much. And so that it really is, it's the last page of the playbook. It's the last tool in the toolbox.
We're just about to close up. I have one question, maybe on a lighter note, but being a climbing podcast, generally speaking, I know that Texas A&M has a climbing wall. I was wondering what the chances are that we show up and get you a pair of rock climbing shoes and get you up that wall.
What are the chances of getting me up the wall? Good question. I don't know. How hard are the walls to climb? I don't know anything about rock. I did see Free Solo, so I will have a rope on.
Yes, definitely.
I'm not climbing. Sure you have a rope.
I'm not climbing without a rope. But if you show up, I'd be happy to try to climb a wall.
Well, before we wrap up, we always ask our guests if there's anything else that they would like to add, they would like to say, or we call it plug something in about a project that you're currently working on or something that you would like to share about yourself.
I don't have any projects that that I think the general public would be that interested in. I'm doing the stuff I always do. I teach, I do research. Follow me on Twitter. I guess that's what I would say. It's I'm often giving my viewpoint on Twitter, and so if you're interested to know what I think about current climate events, follow me there.
I agree. Just for the record, I follow you on Twitter. He's wildly entertaining. So follow him on Twitter for sure.
So what's your Twitter handle though, so people know what to look for?
So it's at Andrew Dessler, just my name.
Okay. I don't know. You want to say anything else?
We're good. Thank you for all the work.
Thank you so much
for joining us today.
Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you so much.